Hey guys, so I have some people who are having trouble with this story, which I understand it is a little bit on the long side for a short story. So I thought I'd read it to y'all and kind of work through it with you and then post this so you can get access to this also as audio. Um, that way, if you need any help with it, you're good to go, okay? So the name of the story is Daughter of Invention, and it was written by a woman named Julia Alvarez. Julia Alvarez was from the Dominican Republic, and she immigrated to America in the 1960s. Um, if you don't know your history of that era and the Dominican Republic, which I'll be honest, I only know because I've read how the Garcia girls lost their accent. In the 1960s, the Dominican Republic had a ruler who was a dictator, and it got really dangerous there. And so this is kind of semi biographical, but not really. She is a writer, but the character is loosely based on her. So I'm gonna read it to you, and I'm gonna post this as soon as it's done. It's Tuesday night, midnight, so some of you might be getting this and being like, "What? You're up?" Yeah, I'm a night owl. So let me get through this with you guys, and then I'll post it, and then if you need it, you got it, okay? So, like it says here, Alvarez was born in New York, but spent the first 10 years of her childhood in the Dominican Republic until her family had to flee the country due to her father's involvement in a political rebellion. The following story is from the novel How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents, which is about the lives of the four sisters spanning 30 years in both the United States and the Dominican Republic. In this short story, Yolanda struggles to write a speech for school. So our narrator's name is Yolanda, and they don't really give it to us anywhere else but in the top part of this, okay? So here we go. She wanted to invent something with my mother. She wanted to invent something, my mother. There was a period after we arrived in this country until 5 or so years later when my mother was inventing. They were never pressing global needs she was addressing with her pencil and pad. She would have said that was for men to do. Rockets and engines that ran on gasoline and turned the wheels of the world. She was just fussing with little house things. Don't mind her. She always invented at night after settling her house down. On his side of the bed, my father would be conked out for an hour already, his Spanish newspaper draped over his chest, his glasses propped up on his bedside table, looking out eerily at the darkened room like a disembodied guard. But in her lighted corner, like some devoted scholar burning the midnight oil, my mother was inventing. Sheets pulled to her lap, pillows propped up behind her, her reading glasses riding the bridge of her nose like a school marm's. On her lap lay one of those innumerable pads of paper my father always brought home from his office, compliments of some pharmaceutical company, advertising tranquilizers or antibiotics or skin cream. In her other hand, my mother held a pencil that looked like a pen, with a little cylinder of lead inside. She would work on a sketch of something familiar, but drawn at such a close range she could attach a special nozzle to a handier handle. The thing looked peculiar. So already we kind of know her mom is kind of traditional Hispanic family, right? Mom takes care of the house, and dad goes out and work. And from what we've been hinted at here, with compliments of some pharmaceutical company, her dad is probably a doctor. It was the only time all day we'd catch her sitting down for herself, was living proof of the perpetual mobile machine so many inventors had sought over the ages, though she never stops. My sister and I would seek her out now when she seemed to have a moment to talk to us. We were having trouble at school, and we wanted her to persuade my father to give us permission to go into the city or to a shopping mall or a movie in broad daylight. So we know perhaps the family is a bit conservative, I guess is the word for it. They want the daughters safe, right? My mother would wave us out of her room. The problem with you girls, I can tell you right now what the problem always boiled down to. We wanted to become American, and my father and my mother at first would have none of it. So the girls want to become more American, and the family is afraid of that, which makes sense, right? You want to hold on to your roots. You don't want to lose them. But when you immigrate, sometimes it's trying to fit in, right? So I think that's maybe what's going on with them. You girls are going to drive me crazy, she always threatened if we kept nagging. When I end up in Bellevue, you'll be safely sorry. So if you don't know this, Bellevue is a hospital. It's an insane asylum. So she's saying you're going to drive me crazy, and I'm going to end up in Bellevue. She spoke in English when she argued with us, even though in a matter of months her daughters were the fluent one. Her English was much better than my father's, but it was still a mishmash of mixed up idioms and sayings that showed she was green behind the ears, as she called it. So her mom is not super fluent, her dad is not fluent at all, and the daughters are very fluent in English. If my sisters and I tried to get her to talk in Spanish, she'd snap, "When in Rome, do unto the Romans." So she's saying fit in with Americans, right? I had become the spokesman for my sisters, and I would stand my ground in that bedroom. "We are not going to that school anymore, Mommy." "You have to." Her eyes would widen with worry. "In this country, it is against the law not to go to school. You want us to get thrown out?" So her mom is worried, right? If they had to flee the Dominican Republic and they get thrown out of the country, they get thrown back to the Dominican Republic. So something to worry about. "You want us to get killed?" Those kids were throwing stones today. "Sticks and stones don't break bones," she chanted. I could tell, though, by the look on her face, it was as if one of those stones the kids had aimed at us had hit her. But she always pretended we were at fault. "What did you do to provoke them? It takes two to tangle, you know." So her mom's worried, right? Obviously, about them getting picked on, but she has to make sure they stay in America so they don't go back to the Dominican Republic. Thanks. Thanks a lot, Mom. I'd storm out of that room and into mine. I never called her mom except when I wanted her to feel how much she had failed us in this country. She was a good enough mommy, fussing and scolding and giving advice, but a terrible girlfriend parent, a real failure of a mom. Back she'd go to her pencil and pad, scribbling and tisking and tearing off paper, finally giving up and taking up her New York Times. Some nights, though, she'd get a good idea, and she'd rush into my room, a flushed look on her face, her tablet of paper in her hand, a cursory knock on the door she'd just thrown open. "Do I have something to show you, Cuquita?" This was my time to myself, after I finished my homework, while my sisters were still downstairs watching TV in the basement. Hunched over my small desk, the overhead light turned off, my lamp shining poignantly on my paper. The rest of the room in warm, soft, uncreated darkness. I wrote my secret poems in my new language. So already we're kind of seeing a parallel, right, between Yolanda and her mom. They both kind of section themselves off. They're both kind of creative types, and they both seem to like to write at night. So I think we're supposed to draw some parallels between them with that. "You're going to ruin your eyes." My mother would storm into my room, turning on the overly bright overhead light, scaring off whatever shy passion I'd just begun coaxing out of a labyrinth of feelings with the blue thread of my writing. "Oh, Mommy," I'd cry out, my eyes blinking up at her. "I'm writing." "Ay, Cuquita." That was her communal pet name for whoever was in her favor. "Cuquita, when I make $1,000,000, I'll buy you your very own typewriter." I'd been nagging my mother for one, just like the one Father had brought her to do his order forms at home. "Gravy on the turkey" was what she called it when someone was buttering her up. She'd pour and butter. "I'll hire your very own typist." Down she'd plop on my bed and hold her pad out to me. "Take a guess, Cuquita." I'd study her rough sketch a moment. "Soap sprayed from the nozzle head of a shower when you turn the knob a certain way." "Coffee with creamer already mixed in." "Timerly water capsules for plants when you were away." "A keychain with a timer that would go off when your parking meter was about to expire." The ticket would help you find your keys easily if you mislaid them. The famous one, famous only in hindsight, was the sick person dragging a square by a rope. A suitcase with wheels? Oh, of course. We'd humor her. What every household needs: a shower like a car wash, keys ticking like a bomb, luggage on a leash. By now, as you can see, it'd become something of a family joke. Our Thomas Edison mommy, our Benjamin Franklin mom. So as you can see, some of these things are actually things that already exist, right? Like if you go to the store, coffee with creamer already mixed in, ready to be bought. Yeah, that exists. You've probably seen like those water globes you stick in plants that exists already. Key with a timer. We don't really have that, but we do have phones, right, that do that for us. And then, we have the tile now, so the thing to help find your keys if you lose it. And we've all seen suitcases with wheels, right? Her face would fall. Come on now, use your head. One more wrong guess, and she'd tell me, pressing with her pencil point to the different highlights of this incredible new wonder. Remember that time we took the car to Bear Mountain and we realized that we had forgotten to pack an opener with our picnic? We kept correcting her, but she insisted this is how it should be said. When we were ready to eat, we didn't have any way to open the refreshment cans. This before flip-top lids, which she claimed had crossed her mind. You know what this is now? A shake of my head. It's a car bumper. But see, this part is a removable can opener. So simple and yet so necessary, no? Yeah, Mommy. You should patent it. I'd shrug. She'd tear off the scratch paper and fold it carefully, corner to corner, as if she were going to save it. But then she'd toss it into the wastebasket on her way out of the room and give a little laugh like a disclaimer. That's half of one or 2 dozen of another. So, as you can see, the mom is wanting some kind of support and she's not getting that, right? So she just throws her stuff away. I suppose none of her daughters were very encouraging. We resented her spending time on those dumb inventions. Here we were trying to fit in America among Americans. We needed help figuring out who we were. Why these Irish kids whose grandparents were mixed 2 generations ago while they were calling us Spicks? Why had we come to this country in the first place? Important, crucial, final things, you see. And here was our own mother, who didn't have a second to help us puzzle any of this out, inventing gadgets to make life easier for American moms. Why, it seemed as if she were arming our own enemy against us. One time she did have a moment of triumph. Every night she liked to read the New York Times in bed before turning off her light to see what the Americans were up to. One night she let out a yelp to wake up father beside her. Bolt upright, reaching for his glasses, which in haste he'd knocked across the room. "¿Qué pasa? ¿Qué pasa? What is wrong?" There was terror in his voice, fear she'd seen in his eyes in the Dominican Republic before we left. We were being watched there. He was being followed. He and mother had often exchanged those looks. They could not talk, of course, though they must have whispered to each other in fear at night in the dark bed. Now in America he was safe, a success even. His Centro Medico in Brooklyn was thronged with the sick and the homesick. But in dreams he went back to those awful days and long nights, and my mother's screams confirmed his secret fear. We had not gotten away after all. They'd come for us at last. Ay, papi, I'm sorry. Go back to sleep, Cuquito. It's nothing really. My mother held up the Times for him to squint at the small print, back page headline, one hand tapping over the top of the bedside table for his glasses, the other rubbing his eyes to wakefulness. Remember? Remember how I showed you that suitcase with little wheels so we would not have to carry all those heavy bags when we traveled? Someone stole my idea and made a million. He shook the paper in his face, shook the paper in all our faces that night. See? This man was no bobo. He didn't put all his pokers on a back burner. I kept telling you, one of these days my ship would pass me by in the night. She wagged her finger at my sisters and my father and me, laughing all the while, one of those eerie laughs crazy people in movies laugh. We had congregated in her room to hear the good news she'd been yelling down the stairs, and now we eyed each other. I suppose we were all thinking the same thing. Wouldn't it be weird and sad if Mommy did end up in Bellevue, as she's always threatened she might? As you can see, right, her mom had a great idea. They didn't support her, and because of that, um, she could have made some money, right? It didn't happen. Yeah, enough. She waved us out of her room at last. There's no use trying to drink spilt milk, that's for sure. It was the suitcase rollers that stopped my mother's hand. She had weather-vaned a minor brainstorm. She would have to start taking herself seriously. That blocked the free play of her ingenuity. Besides, she had already begun working at my father's office, and at night she was too tired and busy filling in columns with how much money they had made that day to be fooling with gadgets. So the mother's time to work, right, is taken from her. And so um, her seriousness too kind of blocks that free flow of ideas. That happens, right? Like writer's block, but with invention. She didn't take up her pencil and pad. Sorry. She did take up her pencil and pad one last time to help me out. In ninth grade, I was chosen by my English teacher, Mr. Mary Joseph, to deliver the Teacher's Day address at the school assembly. Back in the Dominican Republic, I was a terrible student. No one could ever get me to sit down to a book, but in New York, I needed to settle somewhere, and the natives were unfriendly, the country inhospitable, so I took root in the language. By high school, the nuns were reading my stories and compositions out loud to my classmates as example of my imagination at work. This time my imagination jammed. At first I didn't want, and then I couldn't seem to write that speech. I suppose I should have thought of it as a great honor, as my father called it, but I was mortified. I still had a pronounced lilt to my accent, and I did not like to speak in public, subjecting myself to my classmates' ridicule. Recently, they'd begun to warm toward my sisters and me, and it took no great figuring to see that delivering a eulogy for a convent full of crazy old overweight nuns was no way to endear myself to the members of my class. But I didn't know how to get out of it. Week after week, I'd sit down, hoping to polish off some quick, non-committal little speech. I couldn't get anything down. So she has a speech to write, right? And we're having trouble getting it done for multiple reasons. The weekend before our Monday morning assembly, I went into full panic. My mother would just have to call in and say I was in the hospital, in a coma. I was in the Dominican Republic. Yeah, that's it. Recently, my father had begun talking about going back home to live. My mother tried to calm me down. Just remember how Mr. Lincoln couldn't think of anything to say at the Gettysburg. But then, bang! 4 score and once upon a time ago, she began reciting. Her version of history was half invention and half truth, and whatever else she needed to prove a point. Something is going to come if you just relax. You'll see. Like the Americans say, necessity is the daughter of invention. I'll help you. All weekend, all weekend, she kept coming into my room with help. Please, Mommy, just leave me alone. Please, I pleaded with her. But I'd get rid of the goose only to have to contend with the gander. My father kept poking his head in the door to see if I had fulfilled my obligation, a phrase he'd used when we were a little younger, and he checked to see whether we'd gone to the bathroom before a car trip. Several times that weekend around the supper table, he'd recite his valedictorian speech when he graduated from high school. He'd give me pointers on delivery, on the great orators and their tricks. Humbleness and praise and falling silent with great emotion were his favorites. My mother sat across the table, the only one that seemed to be listening to him. My sisters and I were forgetting a lot of our Spanish, and my father's formal, florid diction was even harder to understand. But my mother smiled softly to herself, and turn the Lady Susan at the center of the table around and around, as if it were the prime mover, the first gear of attention. That Sunday evening, I was reading some poetry to get myself inspired. Whitman, in an old book with an engraved cover my father had picked up in a thrift shop next to his office a few weeks back. I celebrate myself and sing myself. He most honors my style who learned under it to destroy the teacher. The poet's words shocked and thrilled me. I'd gotten used to the nuns, a literature of appropriate sentiment, poems with a message, expurgated text, but here was a flesh and blood man belching and laughing and sweating in poems. Who touches this book touches a man. So she's used to like the formal kind of poetry that they were having to study, like the stuff that you would study for like Shakespearean kind of stuff. And Walt Whitman is known for having more of a casual writing style. So she's just surprised by this because it's her first time seeing this. That night, at last, I started to write recklessly. 3, 5 pages, looking up once only to see my father passing by the hall on tiptoe. When I was done, I read over my words, and my eyes filled. I finally sounded like myself in English. As soon as I had finished that first draft, I called my mother to the room. She listened attentively as she had to my father's speech, and in the end, her eyes were glistening too. Her face was soft and warm and proud. That is a beautiful, beautiful speech, Cuquita. I want for your father to hear it before he goes to sleep. Then I will type it for you. All right? Down the hall we went, the two of us, faces flushed with accomplishment, into the master bedroom where my father was propped up on his pillows, still awake, reading the Dominican papers, already days old. He had become invested in his country's fate again. The dictatorship had been toppled. The interim government was going to hold the first free elections in 30 years. There was still some question in his mind whether or not we might want to move back. History was in the making. Freedom and hope were in the air again, but my mother had gotten used to life here. She did not want to go back to the old country where she was only a wife and a mother, and a failed one at that, since she never had the required son. She did not come straight out and disagree with my father's plan. Instead, she fussed with him about reading the papers in bed, toiling those sheets with poorly printed foreign tabloids. The Times is not that bad, she claimed, if my father tried to humor her by saying they shared the same dirty habit. The minute my father saw my mother and me filing in, he put his paper down. His face brightened as if at last his wife had delivered a son, and that was the news we were bringing him. His teeth were already gritting from the glass of water next to his bedside lamp, so he lisped when he said, "It's speech, it's speech." So, if you're not getting this right here, just FYI, he apparently has dentures. "It's so beautiful, Papi," my mother previewed him, turning the sound off on his TV. She sat down at the foot of the bed. I stood before both of them, blocking their view of the soldiers and helicopters landing amid silent gun reports and explosions. A few weeks ago, it had been the shores of the Dominican Republic. Now it was the jungles of Southeast Asia they were saving. My mother gave me the nod to begin reading. I didn't need much encouragement. I put my nose to the fire, as my mom would have said, and read from start to finish without looking up. When I was done, I was a little embarrassed at my pride in my own words. I pretended to quibble with a phrase or two I was sure I'd be talked out of changing. I looked questioningly to my mother. Her face was radiant, determined to share her pride with my father. But the expression on his face shocked both of us. His toothless mouth had collapsed into a dark zero. His eyes glared at me. They shifted to my mother accusingly, in barely audible Spanish, as if Secret microphones or informers were all about, he whispered. You will permit her to read that? My mother's eyebrows shot up, her mouth well open. In the old country, any whisper of a challenge to authority could bring the secret police in their black VW. But this was America. People could say what they thought. What is wrong with her speech? My mother questioned him. What is wrong with her is speech. My father wagged his head at her. His anger was always more frightening in his broken English, as if he had mutilated the language in his fury, and now there was nothing to stand between us and his raw, dumb anger. What is wrong? I will tell you what is wrong. It shows no gratitude. It is boastful. I celebrate myself. The best student learns to destroy the teacher. He mocked my plagiarized words. That is insubordinate. It is improper. It is disrespecting of her teachers. In his anger, he had forgotten his fear of lurking spies. Each wrong he voiced was a decibel higher than the last outrage. Finally, he was yelling at me. As your father, I forbid you to say that is speech. My mother leapt to her feet, a sign she was always about to make a speech or deliver an ultimatum. She was a small woman, and she spoke all her pronouncements standing up, either for more protection or as a carryover from her girlhood in convent school, where one asked for and literally took the floor in order to speak. She stood by my side, shoulder to shoulder. We looked down at my father. That is no tone of voice, Eduardo, she began. By now, my father was truly furious. I suppose it's bad enough I was rebelling, but here was my mother joining forces with me. Soon he'd be surrounded by a house full of independent American women. He too leapt from his bed, throwing off his covers. The Spanish newspapers flew across the room. He snatched my speech out of my hand, held it before my panicked eyes, a vengeful, mad look in his own, and then once, twice, 3, 4, countless times he tore my prize into shreds. Are you crazy? My mother lunged at him. Have you gone mad? That is her speech for tomorrow you have torn up. Have you gone mad? He shook her away. You are going to let her read that insult to her teachers? Insult to her teachers? My mother's face had crumpled up like a piece of paper. On it was written a love note to my father. Ever since they'd come to this country, their life together was a constant war. This is America, Papi. America, he reminded him now. And you are not in a savage country anymore. I was on my knees, weeping wildly, collecting all the little pieces of my speech, hoping that I could put it back together before the assembly tomorrow morning. But not even a Sybil, someone who can tell the future, could have made sense of all those scattered pieces of paper. All hope was lost. He broke it. He broke it, I moaned as I picked up a handful of pieces. Probably, if I had thought a moment about it, I would not have done what I did next. I would have realized my father had lost brothers and comrades to the dictator Trujillo, but for the rest of his life, he would be haunted by blood in the streets and late-night disappearances. Even after he'd been in the States for years, he jumped if a black Volkswagen passed him on the street. He feared anyone in uniform, the meter maid giving out parking tickets, a museum guard approaching to tell him not to touch his favorite Goya at the Metropolitan. I took a handful of the scraps I had gathered, stood up, and hurled them in his face. Zapita, I said in a low, ugly whisper. You're just another Zapita. It took my father only a moment to register the hated nickname of our dictator, and he was after me. Down the halls we raced, but I was quicker than he and made it to my room just in time to lock the door as my father threw his weight against it. He called down curses on my head. ordered me on his authority as my father to open that door this very instant. He throttled that doorknob, but all to no avail. My mother's love of gadgets saved my hide that night. She had hired a locksmith to install good locks on all the bedroom doors after our house had been broken into while we were away the previous summer. In case burglars broke in again and we were in the house, they'd have a second round of locks to contend with before they got to us. Eduardo, she tried to calm him down. Don't ruin my new locks. He finally did calm down, his anger spent. I heard their footsteps retreating down the hall. I heard their door close, the clicking of their lock, then muffled voices, my mother's peaking in anger and persuasion, my father's deep murmurs of explanation and self-defense. At last the house fell silent before I heard, far off, the gun blast and explosion, the serious, self-important voices of newscasters reporting their TV war. A little while later, there was a quiet knock at my door, followed by a tentative attempt at the doorknob. Cuquita, my mother whispered. Open up, Cuquita. Go away, I wailed, but we both knew I was glad she was there, and I needed only a moment's protest to save face before opening that door. We had ended up doing that night was putting together a speech at the last moment. 2 brief pages of stale compliments and polite commonplaces on teachers brought by necessity without much invention, by mother for daughter late into the night in the basement, on the pad of paper and with the same pencil she had once used for her own inventions, for I was too upset to compose the speech myself. After it was drafted, she typed it up while I stood by, correcting her misnomers and missayings. She was very proud of herself when I came home the next day with the successful story of the assembly. The nuns had been flattered, the audience had stood up and given our devoted teachers a standing ovation, what my mother suggested they do at the end of my speech. She clapped her hands together as I recreated the moment for her. I stole that from your father's speech, remember? Remember how he put that in at the end? She quoted him in Spanish and translated for me into English. That night, I watched him from the upstairs hall window where I'd retreated the minute I heard his car pull up in front of our house. Slowly, my father came up the driveway, a grim expression on his face as he grappled with a large, heavy cardboard box. At the front door, he set the package down carefully and patted all his pockets for his house keys. Precisely why my mother had vented her ticking keychain. I heard the snapping open of the lock downstairs, heard as he struggled to maneuver the box through the narrow doorway. Then he called my name several times, but I would not answer him. My daughter, your father, he loves you very much, he explained from the bottom of the stairs. He just wants to protect you. Finally, my mother came up and pleaded with me to go down and reconcile with him. Your father did not mean to harm. You must pardon him. Always, it is better to let bygones be forgotten, no? I guess she was right. Downstairs, I found him setting up a brand new electric typewriter on the kitchen table. It was even better than the one I'd been begging to get, like my mother's. My father had outdone himself with all the extra features, a plastic carrying case with my initials and decals below the handle, a brace to lift the paper upright while I typed, an erased cartridge, an automatic margin tab, a plastic hood like a toaster to keep the dust away. Not even my mother, I think, could have invented such a machine. But her inventing days were over just as mine were starting up with my school-wide success. That's why I've always thought that of that speech my mother wrote for me as her last invention rather than the suitcase rollers everyone else in the family remembers. It was as if she had passed on to me her pencil and pad and said, Okay, Cuquita, here's the buck. You give it a shot. And that is the end, guys. So I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions about the story, please shoot me a line. I know some people have been having trouble with it. It is a little bit of a deeper kind of story. But again, just letting you know, if you Google it, Daughter of Invention actually does pop up in Spark Notes too, if you need a little more background information or anything like that. Okay, guys? So hope that helped, and have a good rest of your week.